Hi everyone, I'm Ava. I'm an American living here in the Netherlands, and today I wanted to talk to you about the stereotypes and impressions that Americans have about the Dutch and the Netherlands. And some of these are quite funny because they are oh so wrong, and others are funny because I was surprised to find that they're actually quite spot on. And I wanted to make this video, yes, so that people can learn about the Netherlands and Dutch culture, but also so that it's interesting to see what the world, and in this case Americans, think about the Dutch. But before I get into the good stuff, I wanted to say that I'm going to be talking about the impressions Americans who have not been to the Netherlands have. So yes, there are very many Americans who have visited the Netherlands, who know Dutch people, and even if they haven't, maybe they're just really familiar with the Netherlands. And in that case, they may not think some of these things that I'm talking about. I am one person and I am not representative of an entire country with over 300 million people. I think 330 million to be more exact. Now with that said, let's get into the good stuff. Now the first thing I wanted to talk about is how there seems to be a lot of confusion in the US about where the Netherlands is located. I think Dutch people watching this are thinking, what is she talking about? The Netherlands is in Europe, end of story. But let me tell you, it's not that simple. My girlfriend, who is Dutch, has lived in the US for several years, and oftentimes when people would ask her where she's from, because she has an accent while speaking English, well, a non-American accent while speaking English, and she would say, I'm from the Netherlands. And it was not uncommon for her to get a question like, so what is it like living in Scandinavia? Or, is it cold living in Scandinavia? So bottom line of that is that Americans tend to think that the Netherlands is in Scandinavia. I think we often, for some reason, think of the Netherlands as being cold and snowy, and we tend to equate it with Sweden or Denmark. I don't know why that is, but even I had that impression before I started visiting the Netherlands and discovered that it really doesn't go below 0 degrees Celsius in the winter. And I wish I could tell you that the confusion stops there, but that is not the case. Oh no. Sometimes Americans tend to equate the Netherlands with Germany, even in terms of location. And you know what? That makes sense, right? Because they're neighbors, they border each other. But I'm talking about one step further than that. Do not be surprised if you are a Dutch person visiting the US and a naive American may think that the Netherlands is in fact Germany or something related to that. But here's what's funny about that. Americans really know that Germany is not in Scandinavia. That is not part of the confusion. But in that case, why do they think the Netherlands is part of Scandinavia and not Germany? This is really confusing to me and apparently also confusing to other Americans. I think Europe is just so diverse that there are all of these little countries and cultures in there that it is hard for us Americans all the way across the Atlantic to keep track of which country is which. I know this sounds terrible, but we try. I promise you, we try. The second point of confusion that I wanted to talk about today is not just about where the Netherlands is located, but about where Dutch people are from and where Dutch is spoken. This problem is not just a problem faced by current modern day America. It goes back, way back. It goes back to the Pennsylvania Dutch. In the US, in the state of Pennsylvania, there are a group of people called the Pennsylvania Dutch. And these people are bilingual. They speak another language in addition to English. Want to guess what language that is? If you guessed Dutch, you are wrong. They speak German. Confused? So am I. When this group of people arrived in America, they said that they spoke Deutsch, and they were Deutsch, perhaps, and as the legend goes, Americans simply translated that as Dutch into English. So not only are we bad at geography, but we're also bad language translators, apparently. And I do think that this kind of confusing the Netherlands with Germany still continues to this day because I do think people equate the two countries together at least. And I don't think many people would be surprised, and I'm talking about the US very generally here. I don't think very many people in general America would be surprised if you said that people spoke German in the Netherlands or Dutch was spoken in Germany. It may be hard to believe and it may not be true of all Americans, but again, not uncommon. You will be surprised. And to further make this confusion more interesting, Sometimes Americans may think that Dutch is spoken in Denmark. You can see how Dutch, Danish, Denmark, Deutsch, all of them are just being muddled together. And if you don't think too hard about it, it kind of makes sense why it's a little bit confusing. Okay, so now that I've talked about all the confusion in America about who these elusive Dutch people even are, I wanted to talk about some impressions of the Dutch that we have in America, or some Dutch stereotypes that actually seem to be true, which is what I found after I moved here to the Netherlands. I thought I would first focus on what Americans get right in terms of stereotypes and impressions, and then after talking about these things in the first bucket, I will talk about what Americans get wrong at the end of the video. So the first stereotype that I wanted to talk about was that Dutch people like drinking beer. Now, ever since I first visited the Netherlands, I've noticed that Dutch people love drinking, period. And yes, beer seems to be very, very common. I'm more of a wine person myself, but I found that as I was hanging out with more and more Dutch people, I started opting for beer more frequently. In fact, when I would visit here in the summers, I would go back to the US. This is before I moved here. I would go back to the US and I would tell my friends that I had to detox a little bit because I drank too many beers. I mean, my impression since I moved here has been that Dutch people really drink a lot, especially beer, and the sheer quantity for me is just too much. I can't keep up. But okay, so those were just my impressions, my experiences, and I thought, why don't I just Google this to see if this is actually true? Do the Dutch love beer more than Americans do? Well, turns out, at least in terms of the amount of beer consumed, Americans consume more beer than the Dutch. Now, this is according to one study done by Statista. I think I'm saying it right, Statista. I'm gonna put the name here. Anyway, according to this one study, Americans consume 75 liters of beer per capita per year, and it's 70 liters here in the Netherlands. So you can see there's a little bit of difference there. And I was surprised because I was really under the impression that it was more of a thing here in the Netherlands. You know, in good European blood and spirit. The next stereotype that I want to talk about that Americans have about the Dutch is that the Dutch love to bike. Now this one's gonna be really short because you know what? That's just a fact, as evidenced by the fact that in the Netherlands there are 23 million bicycles for 17 million inhabitants. You see the difference there? The Dutch really love to bike. If you are someone not familiar with the Netherlands, it will only take you one step into this tiny, wonderful country to have your foot run over by a bicycle. So, moving on to the next stereotype, which is that the Dutch are cheap. It's a little awkward because I put this in the bucket of things Americans got right, but hey, I know there are many caveats to this. But before I go into that, I was wondering, where does this even come from? And I think that this impression of the Dutch comes from some of our Dutch idioms. Namely, one Dutch idiom that is going Dutch on a date, which is when the people on a date pay for their own meal and their own, well, expenses during that date. I also know that this stereotype may come from Dutch immigrants who moved to certain parts of the US, the Midwest of the US in particular, and somehow they got the reputation of being cheap. This is what I've heard from my friends who are more familiar with the Midwest than I am. Okay, so although I've put this in the it's true bucket, there are certain caveats, and one of those caveats is that there is a big difference between the north of the Netherlands and the south of the country. It looks like Southern hospitality isn't just an American thing, but it also carries over here to the Netherlands. The Southerners here are perceived to be more generous, more hospitable, in contrast to the North. A second caveat is that I think the Dutch are not cheap in a way that they don't want to pay for their own stuff. It's more like they don't want to pay for your stuff as well. So this is where we could talk about the going Dutch on a date. Now, I have to say that I am not too familiar with heterosexual dating here in the Netherlands, and I feel like this idiom is more applicable there. Well, in case you didn't know, I'm super gay and not so familiar with dating men in the Netherlands, and really not familiar with heterosexual dating in the Netherlands. Anyway, I have heard from friends of mine and from other Dutch people that it is not uncommon if you go on a date, you have a nice time with the person you're on a date with, and then you go home and you find a tikkie waiting for you. A tikkie is a payment request. And the same is with going out with friends. I think everyone just tends to pay for their own meal and what they ordered. And again, tikkie is very popular here. You just send your friends a payment request and you get your money back. And the final caveat is, what does cheap even mean? Because I feel like the Dutch are more thrifty than cheap. So I feel like there's a different interpretation there. To give you an example, I think a Dutch person would be happy to brag about a good deal that they got. Let's say they got a good deal on a camera, like it was only $50 and it was this really fancy camera. You're maybe more likely to hear about it then if you compliment them on this camera. You say, hey Jan, that's a great camera. And Jan might respond with, yeah, it was $50, how cool am I? As opposed to if Jan had paid maybe like $1,000 for that camera, he wouldn't be as likely to brag about it. And I could totally see someone bragging about spending lots of money on something in the US, like, oh yeah, I spent so much money on this thing and, but I worked so hard. I don't know if that would happen here. So my conclusion is cheap, maybe, but it's probably more like thrifty. That's how I like to see it. Now, the next two stereotypes that they have in America are that the Dutch love eating cheese and tulips. I will say that both of these are true. According to the Kaas Museum here in the Netherlands, yes, there is a cheese museum. Doesn't that prove my point? A Dutch person consumes 17 kilos of cheese per year. That is definitely a lot of cheese. Now, about tulips, it is definitely true that the Netherlands is the largest producer and exporter of tulips. But I've also seen that the Dutch themselves really enjoy tulips. When tulips are in season, I see Dutch people lining up to buy them. And I really like seeing that. It's not just that they export this thing, they also really enjoy it for themselves. Now I want to tell you about a stereotype that's half true. And that is that Dutch people are tall and blonde. Guess which half of that is true? So it is a fact that the Dutch are the tallest in the world. But from my experience, it's not that I've come across too many blonde Dutch people. I feel like that's more a characteristic of Scandinavia. Now that said, not all Dutch people are tall either. It's just on average. So if you are a short Dutchie, comment below. So yeah, on average, being tall, yes, but being blonde, I'm not so sure about that. And this is a nice segue into stereotypes that Americans have about the Netherlands that are not true. And I want to start with the stereotype that Dutch people are strict and like to follow rules. That is so false. I totally cannot keep a straight face while saying this. Okay, if you thought that before, if you're watching this video and you thought that before, I'm here to tell you that Dutch people love to bend the rules. They love knowing what the rules are just so that they can get around them somehow. Now, the reason I think this is a stereotype in America is, yes, because the Netherlands keeps getting equated with Germany, and Germans have this reputation of being very strict and, rule-abiding. But that is not true of the Dutch. To give an example of that, I am pretty comfortable jaywalking in the Netherlands, and I've seen other people, Dutch people, jaywalk in the Netherlands. In Germany, I would be extremely uncomfortable. I've seen my American friends get yelled at in Germany for jaywalking because you have to follow the rules in Germany. But here in the Netherlands, not the case. You do follow rules, but you can also bend them a little. And the final two stereotypes that I want to talk about that are not true are sex and drugs. Yes, the two big ones. I've saved them for last because that's what I like to do. Now, this is such a big stereotype in the US that I was a little bit surprised. Okay, a little ironically. I didn't actually expect this, but I was a little bit surprised that the red light district in Amsterdam didn't just take over the whole city, that it was only restricted to a small part. Okay, so like 6 years ago, if you were to ask me what I thought about the Netherlands, I would immediately go to Amsterdam. I wouldn't even think about the tulips or the clogs. I would think about Amsterdam, and I would think about the red light district in Amsterdam, the drugs, and the I Amsterdam sign. For some reason, I saw a picture of it once, and I just thought that's what the city had, the I Amsterdam sign and these things. That is so shameful. I am so embarrassed to admit this on camera, so like in public. And let's just say I've come a long way since then. Okay, so while some Dutch people may indeed go to the red light district to make use of their services, just like anywhere in the world, it is not the case that going to the red light district is a national pastime. It is not something that the average person may do, at least not that I'm aware of and not from my experiences. And sometimes I think in the US, people assume that because it is so common that Dutch people may go to the red light district to make use of their services quite frequently. But I don't know if there is a real difference there. It is just that here in the Netherlands, sex work is not illegal. And therefore it is regulated. And the people who do this work pay taxes, etc., and they're protected. I think it's fantastic. But frequenting the red light district is no more a part of Dutch culture than it is in other countries. It's not above average here, at least from my experience and to my knowledge. In fact, when American friends of mine visited me here in the Netherlands, they actually remarked at how they were surprised that the red light district in Amsterdam really seemed to be more of a tourist attraction. And I think that sums it up nicely. Now, talking about drugs, in particular marijuana, yes, it is not illegal here, but it's not fully legal either. There are lots of laws surrounding the consumption of marijuana. You have to do them at coffee shops, and then there are other laws about what you would do if you were not in a coffee shop. But it is not just that you could be smoking a joint in front of a police officer carrying a bag full of weed with you. That's just not how it works here. And in fact, in the US, there are many states that have legalized marijuana. So the consumption of marijuana is less restricted in the US right now in some places than it is here in the Netherlands. And I say that because I think sometimes Americans think that Dutch people just do a lot of drugs all the time, or they have constant access to drugs, and that is just not the case. Dutch people aren't walking around high on weed all the time. But if you want to smoke it, you don't need to do it in secret. And that is really one of the things I love about the Dutch government and how the Dutch handle things. It's to make it safe for people to use. So those are some stereotypes and impressions Americans might have about the Dutch and the Netherlands. As usual, let me know what you think in the comments below.